Somewhere near the bottom of the world, a man sits alone in a shack, losing a game of chess to a computer. He has been out there long enough that his beard has grown in thick and his eyes have gone flat with boredom. The computer announces checkmate, and he sits with it for a moment, very still, before opening a hatch on the side of the machine and pouring his whiskey straight into the circuits. "Cheating bitch," he says. That is the first real scene of John Carpenter's The Thing. Not a creature, not a drop of blood, not a single moment of paranoia, just a man who, upon losing a game he cannot win fairly, decides that nobody wins. He destroys the machine rather than accept the result, and then he walks away. That scene has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in horror cinema, because it is not a character quirk. It is the entire film, compressed into 40 seconds, playing out before a single monster has appeared on screen. Tonight we are watching The Thing, and before we get to the creatures and the dread and that ending people have been arguing about for 40 years, there is something about this film that almost nobody talks about, and it starts right there, with a glass of scotch and a chess computer that got what was coming to it. 12 American researchers are stationed at a remote outpost in Antarctica, deep in the winter of 1982, weeks away from any contact with the outside world, and they have been there long enough to run out of conversation. The nearest other human being sits hundreds of miles away across the ice. The men play chess, and listen to music and practice the specific art of not quite looking at each other. A Norwegian helicopter comes over the ridge, chasing a dog. What follows in the first act stands as one of the strangest pieces of horror setup ever committed to film. Carpenter takes his time, lingering on the landscape, on empty hallways, on silences that stretch a beat too long. Morricone's score barely qualifies as music. It sits closer to the sound a building makes when it settles at night, low and unsteady, just enough to plant the feeling that something is wrong without giving you anything to point at. By the time the dog enters the kennel with the others, unease has already moved in, and then the kennel scene arrives, and everything the film has been quietly assembling detonates at once. The special effects in this film are practical, physical, and built entirely by hand, and there is nothing else quite like them anywhere in cinema. A team led by Rob Bottin spent over a year constructing the creatures from foam, latex, rubber, and machinery, and whatever level of preparation you bring to your first viewing, it will not be enough. The film earns everything people say about it. The creatures, though, are not what stayed with me. The question the film is actually asking, that is what stayed. Most horror films include a built-in signal. The score swells, the strings arrive sharp and fast, the cue lands, and your body responds on schedule, and then the moment passes and you settle back into your seat. That contract between the genre and its audience functions because it gives you somewhere to breathe between the scares. The Thing refuses that contract entirely. Ennio Morricone wrote the score, which sounds like news that should be reassuring. By 1982, Morricone had produced some of the most beloved film music ever recorded: the spaghetti western themes, the romantic Italian epics, compositions that had lodged themselves permanently in the culture. None of that appears anywhere in The Thing. What Carpenter received instead barely qualifies as music in the conventional sense. Low electronic pulses, single-held notes, a rhythm that refuses to resolve, sitting under the film like a vibration inside the walls, something the chest registers before the ears do. It never signals safety because it never stops suggesting that safety is no longer available. Carpenter had composed his own scores for most of his earlier work, including Halloween, Assault on Precinct 13, and The Fog, so he understood precisely what a film score could do for an audience. Morricone came aboard specifically because Carpenter wanted something that would offer no emotional instruction whatsoever, a score that sustained unease at a constant level and left the silence between sounds to carry the rest. The result earned Morricone a Razzie nomination for Worst Musical Score. In the summer of 1982, critics heard it as a score that simply did not work. 40 years on, it sounds like a score that was doing something critics had no framework for yet, arriving roughly a decade ahead of the vocabulary needed to describe it. This connects directly to how Carpenter frames the interior of Outpost 31. The base never feels full. Every shot carries an awareness of how many rooms sit empty just past the edge of the frame, how many corridors extend into darkness the camera declines to follow. The architecture itself feels designed for more people than currently occupy it, leaving too many corners unchecked, too many spaces where something could be waiting without your knowledge. The paranoia this film builds does not begin with the creature. It begins with the geometry of the building, with Morricone's hum underneath everything, with the way none of these men quite make eye contact during the opening scenes. Carpenter is telling you, from the very first indoor shot, that something is already wrong. The name for it comes later. Morricone recovered from the Razzie. 30 years after The Thing, he wrote the score for The Hateful Eight, another film shaped by Carpenter's influence, also starring Kurt Russell, set inside a single isolated location, constructed around the question of who in the room is not who they claim to be. That score won him an Academy Award. The committee, if slowly, caught up. Something about The Thing tends to go unnoticed, and it shapes everything that follows. The men at Outpost 31 are not a community. They are 12 individuals who happen to occupy the same building, and the difference matters enormously. The opening shots of the base establish this with care. One man works a jigsaw puzzle in silence. Another sits in the kitchen with headphones turned up so loud that he does not hear the helicopter approaching outside. MacReady occupies a separate shack altogether, drinking scotch and losing to a chess computer, because there is apparently no one at the station whose company he prefers to a machine. These men have been in the same building long enough to exhaust each other, long enough for daily routines to harden into mutual avoidance, and when the Norwegian helicopter arrives and the crisis begins, most of them are still effectively strangers. Carpenter treats this deliberately, giving the film's isolation a double layer. Yes, they are physically cut off, hundreds of miles from the nearest other person, deep in Antarctic winter, with no viable rescue available for weeks. The emotional isolation, though, predates all of that. The base carries the texture of loneliness long before the creature enters the picture, in the long corridors and the separate rooms and the conversations that seem to land without leaving any impression. These are men who traveled to the bottom of the world and brought their solitude with them as luggage. This matters for everything that follows, because the paranoia that takes over the film does not create the distrust between these men, it only reveals what was already there. Strip away the shared crisis and what remains is 12 individuals who had already stopped extending trust to each other, already calculating rather than connecting. All the creature does is give that calculation a name and a set of consequences. MacReady grasps this better than anyone, which is why his leadership never appeals to solidarity or shared humanity. He appeals to self-interest instead, and when that fails, he levels a threat. Cooperate with the blood test, or he detonates the base with everyone still inside. His plan rests on the reality of who these men actually are, rather than who a different film might need them to be. Late in the film, alone in what may be his last hour, MacReady records a voice log. He runs through what he knows and what he can no longer be certain of, and then he says, quietly, that he is sure of one thing: he knows he is human. He says it like a man reciting something to keep himself grounded. The act of stating the words being the only evidence available. That is the film's loneliest moment. Not any of the creature effects, not the violence, but a man alone in a burning building, recording a message no one may ever hear, asserting his own humanity to a tape recorder because there is no one left who would believe him if he said it out loud. Here is what most people miss about this film, and once it clicks, the ending stops being a puzzle. The creature in the thing does not want to destroy the men at the outpost, it wants to become them. It absorbs a living organism down to the cellular level, and produces a copy so complete, the right posture, the right voice, the right memories, the right scar on the right knuckle, that the imitation may not even know it is one. Blair, the station's biologist, runs a simulation on the base computer early in the film. He feeds it everything he has learned about the creature, how it replicates, how a single cell functions as an independent organism, how many people flow through international transit hubs every day. The number the computer returns is this: one infected person reaching a populated area, and the entire global population converts within 27,000 hours, around 3 years. Blair absorbs this result quietly, the way a man absorbs a calculation he ran hoping to be wrong. The paranoia that consumes the film from that point forward, the blood tests, the bound wrists, the accusations building toward violence, reads as hysteria from the outside, but it is in fact the only rational response available to them. You cannot trust what you see. You cannot trust how long you have known someone. You cannot trust that the man sitting across from you at breakfast this morning is still that man. Any one of these 12 could have been replaced hours ago, replaced so completely that the replacement has already forgotten it happened. About halfway through, MacReady states it plainly into the middle of the room. Nobody trusts anybody now, and we are all very tired. That line lands differently on every viewing, because it is not only a description of their immediate situation, it is a description of what the creature has cost them, which turns out to be something more permanent than physical safety. By the time the monster is nearly finished, the men have destroyed each other through their own fear, and people who did not need to die are dead. And this is where the chess scene from the very beginning earns everything. MacReady loses to a machine, and his response is to pour whiskey into its circuits, not out of spite but out of principle. If the game cannot be won cleanly, nobody wins. He does not accept the result, he eliminates the board. By the film's final act, that same logic has scaled up to cover the entire situation, and he walks into the base carrying dynamite because burning everything down is the only move that guarantees containment. When it is over, and the base is rubble, and the cold is moving in fast, MacReady finds Childs, the only other person still standing, and neither man knows whether the other is still human. The test cannot be run, no equipment remains, help is not coming, they will freeze to death either way. MacReady passes Childs the bottle. They sit there watching the fire die, and you feel what neither of them says. This is what it cost. Not just the creature, the warmth, the instinct to trust. the ability to hand someone a drink without watching their face too closely when they swallow. Carpenter has said for years that he knows exactly how that ending resolves, which of those two men was still human at the close. He has never said. The answer he holds lives in not knowing, and the film was designed to keep you there permanently, sitting in the cold with them, unable to be certain. Rob Bottin was 22 years old when Carpenter hired him, fresh from constructing the werewolf transformation in The Howling, which already stood among the best practical effects work ever put on film. For The Thing, Carpenter offered a brief with no ceiling. The creature has no fixed form, has traveled across the galaxy absorbing life for millions of years, and can become anything it has ever consumed. Go. Bottin moved onto the Universal lot and did not leave. 7 days a week, for a year and 5 weeks straight without a single day off, he worked, sleeping in the locker room and on the sets to remain always on call. His crew expanded to over 40 people, and a budget originally set at $200,000 climbed to $1.5 million as the scope of the work became clear. The materials included foam latex, fiberglass, hydraulics, marionette wire, radio controls, pull cables, and for the fluids and gore, heated bubblegum, strawberry jam, mayonnaise, and creamed corn. The Blair Thing creature built for the film's finale alone required 300 pounds of foam rubber. The defibrillator scene nearly destroyed the production entirely. 4 months of work had gone into building the Norris chestmouth puppet from foam rubber materials that turned out to be flammable, and when Carpenter decided on the day that he wanted real fire in the shot, the entire model ignited and burned. The replacement was built in a week. That is the shot in the finished film. When filming wrapped, Bottin checked himself into hospital with exhaustion, pneumonia, and a bleeding ulcer. He was 23 years old. Watching those creatures now, what strikes you is how completely they resist categorization. The brain reaches for costume or prop or performer in a suit and finds nothing to grip. The thing does not look like an alien, because it does not resemble anything that has ever existed, anywhere, in any form, and every version of it functions as a visual argument for the same point the film makes philosophically. Certain threats carry no recognizable shape, and by the time one takes form in front of you, the moment for preparation has already gone. None of that came about by chance. A 23-year-old artist worked himself into a hospital bed to produce something that could not be dismissed or deflected with a laugh, and the feeling that work generates, that bodily wrongness, that refusal to settle, is precisely what you carry home when the credits roll. On June 25, 1982, The Thing opened in American cinemas. Steven Spielberg had released E.T. the Extraterrestrial exactly 2 weeks earlier, and that film was still selling out theaters across the country. Opening the same day in the number 2 slot was Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. By any reasonable measure, this was the worst possible summer to open a film about alien life forms being burned alive in Antarctica. The reviews arrived like a verdict. The New York Times delivered foolish, depressing, overproduced. Roger Ebert filed barfbag movie and geek show. Cinefantastique, the most respected science fiction publication of that era, ran The Thing on its cover above the headline, "Is this the most hated movie of all time?" Morricone's score, that slow alien pulse sitting under every scene like a structural fault in the floor, pulled a Razzie nomination for Worst Musical Score, which remains one of the more baffling footnotes in awards history. The piling on, Carpenter said years later, was insane. Science fiction fans felt he had betrayed some kind of trust. The director of the original 1951 film went on record criticizing him publicly. Universal canceled a multi-picture deal with Carpenter as a direct consequence of the box office, and he lost the job directing Firestarter before production had even begun. Years passed before he could discuss the film in interviews without it sitting badly. What had converged against The Thing was a specific cultural moment the film had no answer for. The country was deep in a recession, and people sitting in summer cinemas wanted warmth and escape, and some assurance that things come out right. 2 weeks of falling in love with a creature who only wanted to go home had not prepared audiences to be told, in a cold room, that the person in the next seat might already be something else entirely. One critic called the film cold and sterile, and cataloged its failures against the competition. The optimism of E.T., the integrity of Blade Runner, the technical achievement of Tron, every item on that list was intended as an indictment. What the list actually described was a film that refused to offer comfort, and a critic who found that refusal unforgivable rather than deliberate. The audience that needed The Thing found it eventually, not in cinemas but alone at home, on small screens in dark rooms, with no crowd around to make dismissal feel socially safe. Something about that private encounter, that context of solitude the film had always been designed for, let it do what it had been trying to do all along. The people who found it that way still talk about it as though it was made specifically for them, and in a meaningful sense it was, because they are the audience who already understood that some things do not resolve neatly and did not need a film to pretend otherwise. Carpenter has said his career would have looked completely different had The Thing been a summer hit, and there is no reason to doubt that. The version of this film made after a successful opening weekend would have smoothed the edges. given MacReady a cleaner ending, and told you which man in the snow was still human. The failure preserved the thing that makes it last. There is one scene in The Thing with no creature effects at all. No transformation, no gore, nothing that appears in any highlight reel, and it is the scene that explains the whole film. Blair, the station's biologist, played by Wilford Brimley, has just finished running his computer simulation. Into the model he fed everything he now knows about the creature. How replication works at the cellular level. How quickly a single organism can spread. How many people move through the world's airports and transit hubs every day. The number that comes back is 27,000 hours from first contact to total global assimilation, which works out to approximately 3 years. Blair takes the result in without expression, the way a man absorbs a calculation he ran hoping it would come out wrong. Then Blair walks into the storage area and begins destroying things, the radio equipment, the helicopter, the vehicles, the sled dogs, calmly and without hurry, working through a mental list of every exit the infection could use to leave the base. When the other men reach him, they lock Blair in the tool shed and read the whole episode as a breakdown, the kind of collapse this situation might reasonably produce. The assumption is that the reality of their circumstances has finally become too much for him. He has not broken down. At that point in the film, Blair is the only person on the base who has thought the situation through to its conclusion. What he has understood, and what the film circles without ever quite stating directly, is that survival is not the correct priority, containment is. The rational response to his simulation is not self-preservation, it is to ensure nothing leaves the base, including himself, which is why he burns the exits without hesitation and without panic as an act of cold arithmetic. MacReady arrives at the same position through a completely different route. He never sees Blair's simulation. What he carries is the principle from the film's opening scene, applied at scale. If the game cannot be won cleanly, the board burns. By the time he straps on the dynamite and walks back into the base, both men have converged on identical conclusions from opposite directions, and neither of them would describe what they are doing as heroism. The creature at the center of this film wants, above everything else, to survive and to spread. That is the complete inventory of its desires. The humans stop it, if they stop it, not through strength or cleverness or any conventional courage, but by being willing to accept a version of events in which they do not survive either. The winning move turns out to be the willingness to ensure there is nothing left to win. That is the one thing the creature cannot do. Self-preservation is the only drive it possesses, which means sacrifice is structurally outside its capabilities, and the single advantage the men hold, right at the end, is the capacity to want something more than their own survival, whether that constitutes humanity, or simply a different kind of desperation being the question the film leaves you with, right up until the fire goes out. Over 40 years have passed since The Thing arrived in cinemas and was rejected for being too cold, too honest, and too unwilling to tell audiences what they wanted to hear. The question it asks, who here is still who they say they are, has not gotten smaller in that time, and if anything it fits more places now than it did in 1982. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from living in a time when doubt has become the default setting. When you read a message from someone you have known for years and feel a hesitation you cannot quite name, when things that used to feel solid start carrying the faint sensation of wearing someone else's face. The Thing does not predict any of that, and it offers no solutions. What it does is name the feeling with unusual precision and then sit inside it with you for 2 hours without flinching. This film will not leave you feeling safe, and that was never what it was built for. What it offers instead is something less common. It takes the specific tiredness of having to verify everything, of trust becoming a calculation rather than a reflex, and it confirms that other people have carried that weight, that it has always been part of what being human costs, and that at the end, when everything had burned and the cold was coming in, they still passed the bottle. Tonight is the right night for this one. Find it in the dark with the volume up. Pay attention to the opening scene, the chess, the scotch, the decision MacReady makes before the film has introduced a single threat. Watch how that same logic runs through every choice he makes from that moment to the final frame. Watch Blair in the storage room and register that he is not panicking. Watch the blood test and feel the temperature in the room drop. When the ending comes, those two men sitting in the snow, the fire burning lower between them, neither one certain about the other. What matters is not what the fan theories conclude. What matters is what you feel in that moment, watching his face across the dying fire. Out of the two of them, which one do you believe?